The wind carried dust across the hard-baked earth as Clara Dawson walked into Dry Creek, her boots worn thin, her dress clinging with the sweat of miles. Her heart weighed down with more memories than belongings, and though the town looked small and ordinary to the passing eye, just a scatter of wooden buildings, a leaning church steeple, a saloon spilling laughter and smoke, it loomed before her as the last chance. She had to live with dignity, for behind her were graves, debts, and the kind of hunger that leaves scars on the spirit. And ahead of her she hoped to find a scrap of mercy, perhaps a few coins, perhaps even honest work. And with a satchel slung across her shoulder, she carried only what little the world had not stolen from her, yet she carried herself straight. Because Clara knew she could not afford to appear broken, not in a land that chewed up the weak. So she moved past the curious stares of townsfolk, past whispers about the stranger woman without husband or kin, until she reached the wide-open fields where Calder Ranch stretched across the horizon, like a kingdom of wood and earth. The fences long, the barns proud, the cattle grazing under the watchful eyes of men who worked like the land itself belonged to their very bones. And there, among them, was the man she had heard about in her travels, James Calder, the cowboy whose name carried equal parts respect and wariness, a man known for running his ranch with iron steadiness, for being as hard as the storms that blew off the plains, a man widowed young and hardened further by years of solitude, a man who had all the land he could want but none to share it with. And as Clara stood near the corral, watching him break a restless stallion, with a patience that was more dangerous than force, she gathered every ounce of courage and stepped forward, her voice trembling at first but steadying with her desperation. "Sir, I came to ask if you've work for me. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, tending the stock. Whatever you need." "I'll earn my keep," she said, gripping the strap of her satchel like it held her whole soul. And James, tall and broad-shouldered, sweat glistening on his brow, turned to look at her with eyes that seemed to measure more than her words, eyes that studied not just her face, but the weight she carried inside. And for a long moment he said nothing, the silence pressing against Clara's ribs until her breath faltered. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've got work for you, but only on one condition." And she, too quick, desperate to seize the chance, nodded. "Anything, sir, name it." But James did not smile nor soften. Instead, he said with the bluntness of a gunshot, "Only if you'll marry me by sunset." And the words struck her like a whip across the face, her knees nearly giving way, her mouth parting with disbelief. "Marry you by sunset? You don't even know me," she whispered, clutching her satchel tighter. But James stood calm as a mountain, his gaze steady, his tone resolute. "I know enough. You're strong enough to walk miles through dust instead of laying down to die. You've got grit in your voice when you ask for work, not charity, and I've no use for games. Miss, this land demands a partner, not a drifter, and if you'll have it, I'll offer you a place, a name, and a future. But the choice is now, not tomorrow." And with that he turned back toward the corral, as though the matter were no more unusual than setting a fence post, leaving Clara's heart to pound with fury, fear, and something stranger. Because his words, though impossible, were not laced with mockery or lust, but with an odd kind of certainty, as if he'd simply spoken the truth of the land. And though every fiber of her mind screamed to turn and run, her feet stayed rooted, and as the day stretched long, Clara lingered watching James work, watching the way he spoke little but did much, the way he treated his men firm but fair, the way he took burdens onto his own shoulders instead of commanding from distance. And in his silence, she did not see arrogance but a loneliness, so deep it mirrored her own. And as the sun crawled west, her thoughts tangled tighter, her fear warring with the strange pull of destiny. When at last the horizon burned red and gold, James came to her again, his face unreadable, his tone steady. "The sun's near gone, Clara. What's your answer?" And she, trembling, asked, "Why me? Of all the women in town, why ask me?" And for the first time his eyes softened, his voice lowering to something almost vulnerable. "Because you ask to work, not to beg. Because you carry yourself like a flame that refuses to die. Because I see in you the same fire the land asks of me every day. I don't ask you to be perfect. I ask you to be here, and to stand with me against the storms." And in those words, Clara felt seen in a way she never had before. Not as a burden, not as a widow or an orphan, not as a woman to be pitied or owned, but as a partner, equal in strength if not in station. And the tears that burned her eyes were not of weakness, but of release. And though fear still clawed her, courage rose higher. And when the last rim of sun dipped, Clara lifted her chin and whispered, "Yes," the word trembling like thunder in the still air. And James reached for her hand, rough calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a surprising gentleness, his lips curving into the faintest smile as he said, "Then by sunset you're mine, and I'm yours." And as the stars pierced the deepening sky, the town whispered of scandal and shock, but Clara and James stood unshaken, bound not by romance born of chance meetings and stolen glances, but by a pact of fire and survival, a love that would grow not in softness but in storms, a love that would endure not because it was easy, but because it was chosen. And dear friend, if this tale has gripped your heart, if it has reminded you that even in the harshest lands, there are choices that shape destiny, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. For more stories of the Wild West await you, stories of grit, sacrifice, love, and the timeless courage to stand tall against the storm.